Martin Wolf, welcome back on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to see you, Martin. We've now had Donald Trump in office for a year. Um, uh, what has changed in the world economy since then? Are we still living in the same world, or are we, in economic terms, living in a completely different world?
There are two answers to that. I think, in terms of expectations, some policy parameters, and the perceived future, increasingly, we're living in a different world. Uh, and that creates a disjunction because, of course, the actual economy doesn't change very quickly unless you have an event like a world war, which thank God we haven't had for a very long time, which does change things incredibly quickly. Essentially, economies go on doing what they're doing. So most of the transactions are continuation of previous transactions. The businesses are essentially the same. Trade flows continue, financial capital flows and so forth continue. You look at growth rates, where they're all something incremental on what was there before. So I think it's very, very important for people to remember that actual economies, people's livelihoods, what they go out to do every day, doesn't change that quickly unless you've got a stupendous shock like a pandemic. Well, that changed things, or a war. A major war. But the framework, and I've written several columns on this, within which all this activity is going on, has become at the least wildly uncertain and unpredictable, and in some obvious and important ways has actually changed. So we're living in one of those, to use a cliche, Wile E. Coyote moments when you think you're going to go over a cliff, but actually you're not going over a cliff because you can't go over it that quickly.
Or at least you haven't felt the impact of going over the cliff until you look down, and then suddenly you
You
plummet to the ground.
realise that you're coming to the ground, which actually, so far, we're not. And this is linked, I think it's very important, with us, partly with the fact it wasn't as revolutionary as all that, and partly what my friend Robert Armstrong, a colleague, has called the taco. Trump always chickens out. His bite isn't nothing, but his bite is less bad, much less bad than his bark, which means that actually he hasn't changed everything. It's just everything has become uncertain.
So the stock market should be at an interesting intersection of those two things, because valuations of stocks are partially based on last quarter's earnings and the business that is ongoing, but it's also a bet on the future, right? It's the expectation that markets have about how well a company is going to do over the next many years. Why is it that the stock market is not quite at record highs as we're reporting, as we're speaking, because it's gone down a little bit over the last couple of days, but very close to record highs, higher than it was a year ago, at a time when tariffs are much higher than they were a year ago, and it was widely predicted that that would harm the economy in a very serious way. We see the investigation and then potentially prosecution of Jay Powell as the head of the Federal Reserve. We see extreme political pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates, and the likelihood that a new appointee, which Trump is going to be able to name relatively soon, is going to be a partisan apparatchik who just does the bidding of the White House. All of that should at the very least make investors less certain about whether Amazon and Apple and Nvidia and all of those companies are going to continue to bring in the returns that have earned them those outsized valuations in the stock market. And yet, um, the market is up. So what's going on with that? How can we make sense of this?
Well, there are several answers. One answer is uh, I've never regarded the market as a very good predictor of what is actually going to happen, and that's consistent with the evidence in the medium to long run. But I think it's important to disentangle what we're talking about. You're talking about, it's very interesting, you're talking about the market is the US market. The US market is very, very important. Of course, it's the most important stock market in the world and has now been for a very long time. But actually, strangely, in the last year, it's non-US markets that have been doing particularly well. European markets have done much better than had been expected. In a way, that's even more surprising because you'd think that Trump's tariffs, whatever they do to the US, should have hit the rest of the world even harder. But that doesn't seem to be the way it has been playing out at all. There are a number of. It's not just about the US. It's a much more complicated story. But I think there are several answers on this. The first is that, and it's something I pointed out in a column, I think a week or two ago, I can't remember exactly, the world economy, since the pandemic, overall has been doing really well. And not just the American, which is clear, but generally that we've had a very strong recovery from the pandemic. Profits have been doing very well. And over and above that, we have a very big technological revolution going on, centered on the US, also now increasingly on China, and whose benefits ought to be available to everyone in the world. So it's not just about the profits of those companies, but the opportunities that will be created by using these new technologies. And in addition to all that, it's really very important to remember...
You mean artificial intelligence, of course.
Yes, I mean artificial intelligence. And it's also important to remember that, betting that the world economy will grow and that profits will be made by new businesses had been pretty consistently a good bet. There have been ups and downs for at least since the 70s, which is a very long time, well outside the time horizon of most investors. So, and very far last thing, well, this is an era of easy money. You might be a bit worried about inflation, yes, reasonable, but in an inflationary age, it's quite sensible to hold real assets. And gold is a real asset, so they're doing very well, and silver's a real asset, but so are stocks. Yes, there could be disruption, but a reasonable assumption is, in the long run, medium to long run, equities are a good hedge against inflation. They're not perfect. You can get profit squeezes of various kinds, but if you're worried about inflation, sell bonds. That's the most obvious thing to do, and that might be a real problem for some of our governments. But equities are not unreasonable. But for all these reasons, I don't find what we are seeing in the markets worldwide and the optimism about growth unreasonable. And it is worth stressing, in addition, that the tariffs per se, as they ended up, are clearly a disruption. But they are, interestingly, tariffs of the US against the world. And the US is a very big market, but as I point out to Com today, the US only accounts for 17% of world's imports of goods and services. Of course, that's important. But there's another 83%. And they're continuing to trade, not only continuing to trade as before, they're just finishing big trade deals. Look at the EU-India deal. That's a very big trade deal. We haven't abandoned trade. The US has. So I think people are basically saying to themselves, Trump isn't as bad as they think. The US isn't actually going to blow up. The rest of the world is fine and coping quite well. And the best thing to do is bet that capitalism will basically continue to perform. This might be wrong, but I think that's what people are saying.
And that's a very strong reconstruction of why that optimism isn't obviously silly, isn't, and I think there's a tendency among opinion journalists, whether op-ed writers or podcasters, to assume that everybody is stupid and nobody understands things. And, when the markets are so high, they may very well be betting on the wrong horse, and they may very well be underestimating some of those tail end risks. But you first need to understand the logic that leads a lot of very sophisticated people with a lot of money riding on making the correct calls before you can then go on to criticize them.
Markets are expensive, so that is a reason for believing in correction. But it's not obvious to me that what markets are betting on is insane.
Now, one of the foundations of this is the idea of taco, that Trump always chickens out. there's two concerns I have about that. One is a straightforward one, which is that he has chickened out, particularly on economic policy, repeatedly over the course of the last year. He seems to be chickening out on Greenland in certain ways, so this is something that might apply beyond economic policy as well. But of course, he is quite unpredictable, and he has done some things that are more extreme than people would have predicted, certainly over the course of the last year. And so the fact that he has chickened out on a number of things during the first year of his administration does not predict with certainty that he's going to continue doing so in year 2 and year 3 and year 4. And of course, I'm sure that Trump is well aware of the term taco at this point. And given that he is, if nothing else, a proud and a man of vanity, he probably wants to disprove that applies to him. The second point, which is a slightly more subtle point I've seen somebody make on social media, is that the sort of dynamics of taco are gonna get more and more gnarly, which is to say that at the beginning, Trump makes an announcement, I'm gonna raise all these tariffs. Immediate panic in the financial markets, stocks go down a lot. Very strong signal. That's what makes all of Trump's allies say, you can't do this, and he backs down, right? The next time that Trump makes an extreme announcement, the market reaction is more muted because people start to think, well, he chickened out last time, perhaps he'll chicken out again this time. But that means that the mechanism that made him back down last time has become a little bit weaker. But it's still enough, and he chickens out again, right? And then the third time that he makes an extreme announcement, the markets say, taco, I've read the column, I know the term, let's just ignore this. There's barely any reaction in the markets, and then perhaps Trump thinks it's safe to go ahead with this. So is taco a kind of a resource that gets whittled down and consumed over time because sort of a game of chicken that is involved just keeps getting more to knife's edge? The driver has to jump out at a later and later stage for the mechanism to get going.
I think that's not implausible. So I've never been fully confident that one should rely on it. And I think foreseeing what Trump will do is certainly be way beyond my pay grade. But it does seem to me there's an argument to be made that the areas where he's really passionate about sort of breaking the mold are relatively few. I mean, if I compare him with other autocratic leaders with big ambitions, I'm not making any other comparison, but just think, obviously, of Mr. Hitler. It was pretty obvious, ex post, that he actually wanted to change the entire world and, among other things, conquer the whole of the East and repopulate it. That was just a spectacularly big, indeed insane and criminal ambition. But what does Trump want to do? He wants to change trade policy. Lots of tariffs. He doesn't want to break the world, but he wants to change trade policy. He's done that. He wants to eliminate the US deficit, but he hasn't actually taken any of the main measures that will be needed to do that. And I'm sure he's surrounded by people who must be telling him that. He wants to be a big presence on the world. Sorry,
and in fact, there was just a news story as we're recording in the New York Times today, I'm sure in the Financial Times as well, that the US trade deficit is now at record highs, that as a result of economic policies over the last year, the trade deficit has increased, which is the opposite of what he wanted.
Yeah, exactly. Because he's not coherent and not logical, and he's replaced Mr. Maduro in Venezuela. I mean, this is about as small a thing as you can do. He wants to give Putin a big chunk of Ukraine. What he wants to do in Iran. All I'm saying is, this is not a man who wants to revolutionize the world. He does want to withdraw the US from its post-war hegemonic role. That's very important, but it's one of those slow motion changes. So I just sort of think one mistake where he does, I think, really want to change things is the way the US works. And that's why I think ICE and how it operates may be the most important thing he's doing. But I think increasingly when I look at this guy in the world, he's sort of he's conservative and revolutionary in some sense at the same time, but his ambitions are quite small. So Taco is not required to change anything very radical. It's not clear to me that he actually wants to shake the world as a whole from top to bottom. He just sort of wants to withdraw from it, which has very big implications, but very different implications from a revolutionary. So if I were an American looking at this, I would say, as I really sort of wrote in my book on this, the real issue is, will our democracy survive? That's very important. But does Trump really want to shake the world in a meaningful sense as other great revolutions have? My instinct is no.
That's a really interesting point. A churlish way of saying this is he doesn't want to revolutionize the world, he just wants to put his name on it.
He wants to put his name on it, and he wants to take America home, which is a very big change, and it will change things, and you can see it's changing Europe now, and this is all very important. But it doesn't mean that it shakes the world when we begin to realize, is the whole monetary system of the world, the whole economic system of the world going to be utterly different tomorrow? It doesn't feel like that.
Why? I sort of understand Trump's obsession with tariffs. I think it's a misperception of a world, but you can see how somebody who's, has a certain set of economic instincts about the world thinks, why am I walking down Fifth Avenue and there's all of these Japanese and German cars? And he's on the record in the 1980s saying that. I want it to be American cars. And how do we make sure to do that? Well, we put up tariffs so that these bad German and Japanese cars can't come in. I sort of see why he is so obsessed with that, right? It's easy to understand where that comes from. I'm a little bit more surprised by the fact that he clearly is very deeply committed to having low interest rates. Is that because of, if you're a real estate guy, low interest rates are helpful because you can, take out mortgages more cheaply, and so he's always wanted low interest rates throughout his career for that reason? Is it that, there is some theory that's coherent so far as it goes, that low interest rates stimulate the economy, and if the economy is going well, then I'm going to be more popular, and people are going to think it's a Trump boom? Is it that economic theory is just right insofar as it goes, but of course if you go too far, then inflation shoots up and you have all the problems that ironically probably elected Trump the second time, among a host of other reasons? Why is it that he's so sort of obsessed with putting pressure on the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates faster than its governors think sensible?
Well, it would be absolutely insane for me to say that I understand the intellectual processes of Donald Trump, because I really don't, because I think can be few men more different than him and me. But I have come to the view, so this is a hypothesis, that he really, really does view the world through the lens of a real estate developer. He thinks that it makes lots and lots of sense for America, like a good real estate developer, to borrow money. But of course, it's much better to borrow money if it's cheap. And unlike Trump real estate developer, Trump president owns the US government, which in his view includes the Federal Reserve. And the job of the Federal Reserve is precisely to do that, from his point of view, because he now owns the bank, which he didn't in the past, and when he was a businessman, and that created him lots of problems because he bankrupted himself, or his projects got bankrupted many times. So I think he thinks the job of the Federal Reserve, which is my bank, just as the government is my government, is to make sure borrowing, which is part of what he's done with his fiscal policy. He's got a massively expansionary fiscal policy. I control the bank. I can force people to lend to me cheaply. So why am I not doing it? Why is this person stopping me from doing this? Now, you would say because it's inflation. Well, Donald Trump has never thought about inflation. That's a systemic problem. He has no idea in his mind what the whole economy is, how things add up in the whole economy. That's not how he have things. I think similarly, as a businessman, it's obvious to him if he spends more than his income on the products of some other company and he's running a deficit in that sense, he is going to go bankrupt. So if the Germans insist on, and the Japanese and the Chinese, on selling more to him than they buy from him, they're going to drive him into bankruptcy. He doesn't like that either. Now, one way he can get round this, as Mr. Besant has told him, is to drive down the interest rates of the Fed. It's not as good as forcing them to rebalance, and he's not going to go any further, but he thinks that's very bad, wicked of these people, and they're defrauding the US. And the final thing I think he thinks is, when I look at my wonderful fortress country, when was it really proud and great and powerful? And the answer from his point of view, it was a proper booming, the world's China, as it were, in the late 19th and early 20th century, when we had huge tariff wars, and we stopped all these wretched countries from sending anything to us. In fact, we built American industry. So we should go back to that. And these are very primitive, very basic, perfectly natural ideas for a not particularly intellectual, put it mildly, business person like him to hold. They're not consistent or coherent, but I think I've come to the view that's actually how he thinks.
Explain one thing to me that is sort of taken for granted in discussions of particularly the very contentious relationship between Donald Trump and the Federal Reserve, and this extraordinary announcement of an investigation into Jerome Powell. Now, part of this, as you're saying, is that I have argued for a long time at this point that a hallmark of authoritarian populism is the unwillingness to accept checks and balances, the unwillingness to accept limitations on power. I'm the elected president. I should be able to decide what I want. How come there's this weird independent institution that kind of gets to define my will? That is illegitimate. So that's a kind of relatively straightforward piece.
Yeah.
But why is it that the independence of a central bank is so important? Because the case that 10, 15 years ago, a lot of my friends on the left were making, and that now some of the people in the Trump universe is making, is at least superficially compelling, right? Where interest rates lie has big downstream consequences on economic life. When you have higher interest rates, you often have lower inflation, but you also have higher unemployment rates. When you lower the inflation rate, you often raise inflation, but you also stimulate the economy, and it can lead to lower unemployment rates, to more people finding a job. That's not always true, and it's within limits, and you can complicate that picture in a million ways to make it more sophisticated than I, as a humble political scientist, have made it. But there's some amount of trade-off there. And isn't that a political trade-off? Isn't that something that elected politicians should decide? Isn't that something that we as the people should have a say over? Because it's a normative trade-off between two different reasons, right? There's at least a very reasonable prima facie case that this should be subject to democratic control, and that perhaps the fact that so many things haven't been subject to democratic control, including things like interest rates, are one of the reasons why people got pissed off and voted for all these populists in the first place. So, having laid out that case, what is the reason why the independence of central banks is so important? What is the reason why, if there is this investigation into and then perhaps prosecution of Jerome Powell, that's not just potentially an injustice where an upstanding public servant is being scapegoated because they happen to be in the wrong position at the wrong time and they're not willing to bow to Trump's pressure. It's actually a problem for the long-term well-being of the US economy and perhaps the world economy.
Okay, there's no very quick answer to that, but I'll do my best to make it as quick as possible. I think there's a broad point and a narrow one. The broad point is, and I think you as a political scientist know this very well, I presume all your listeners do and watchers do too, is that a democracy in which the government can do whatever it wants on any moment and for any reason will pretty soon cease to look like a democracy. There have to be constraining institutions. At the very least, there have to be institutions that ensures fair elections. You have to have institutions that ensure political rights and protect them against this government. And that pretty quickly gets you to the position in which you have to have some sort of independent rule of law, which protects these things. We can discuss how far it goes. So a democracy ceases to be a democracy if an elected government can do whatever it wants. I think that's pretty clear. So absolute democracy is its own antithesis. I don't think that's very difficult. Then the question comes, well, what about money? Where does it fit? Should it be part of the political domain? Should it be outside the political domain, or should it be somewhere in between, which is where we are, in that the politicians decide who the Fed chairman is, or the governor of a central bank. The politicians set the law within which it operates, and that's absolutely clear. There is a not a completely clear law, but the Fed is mandated to pursue low unemployment and price stability. It has a dual mandate, which is itself more progressive than that in, for example, Germany, which you know very, very well, where in Europe we focus on price stability alone. But it's clear it's within a political context, as of these other institutions, but it is given very substantial operational independence. Why is that? I think there's a general answer and a very specific historical one, which is important to remember. The general answer is the power over money is immense. It's an immense power, but wielded irresponsibly, it's immensely destructive, because the danger is that you get a government which decides, well, essentially we can print money without limit. We can finance any size of fiscal deficit comfortably with the printing press. We can use it to do anything, which means we can ignore normal budgetary procedures and rules. And that gives not only the government immeasurable power, but over time, this destroys money. And we've had lots and lots and lots of examples of this, if I may say so, and just look down at the south of South America, at the history of Argentina. So it's not theoretical, but economists, almost all economists would admit there has to be some constraint on this, and an institutional constraint, given that there are basically two ways we've done it. One is a tie to a commodity, the gold standard, an absolute tie. That was basically blew up in the 30s, and no one has gone back to that. I can discuss at length why it's not a good idea, but that will be an alternative. And there are lots of people in America, by the way, who believe you go back on the gold standard. That's certainly not what Donald Trump wants. And the alternative is to give it to an institution, a good, found, independent institution. And in the post-war period, at the beginning, as it were, the only two, I'll leave aside Switzerland, sui generis, small, there were two major countries, the US and Germany, which had that sort of institutional arrangement, an independent central bank, which had its own mandate, and then most of the others, the British, the French, and all the rest of it, had a pretty politicized central bank after the Second World War. And by about 1980, there was a consensus of basically everybody, all the economists, that when you look back at the record, the governments that allowed the politicians to tell the central banks to do whatever they wanted them to do, their economies just performed far worse, had worse inflation, worse unemployment, worse instability than the ones with a more stable and separate and independent institution. And the experience in the early 70s, which led to the great inflation of the 70s, when basically President Nixon suborned the Fed, confirmed to everybody in America and outside, that showed that this idea of a central bank as at least having operational and substantial independence just worked better. And why was that? Well, the economist who argued this most persuasively was Milton Friedman. What he basically said, in the short to medium run, more inflation will make you feel all better. It will cheer people up, and that's why
reduces the economy.
Politicians give you 2 or 3 years or 4 years of great fun. And then you end up with very serious inflation. Inflation expectations go through the roof. Interest rates explode. You get interest rates ultimately of 20% or so. Vast bankruptcies, mass unemployment. It's a terrible trade-off. The people who had properly independent central banks, above all the Germans, did best. And that's why in Britain and France and everywhere else, people went into the exchange rate mechanism in Europe. They created the single currency. So this didn't come out of nothing. The theory turned out to be true. It actually strengthened politics if we had a pretty sound central bank. And now we've forgotten that because this is half a century ago, and anything that happened half a century ago is essentially as if it was in the early Middle Ages for most people. But nonetheless, that's what most economists still believe, and this old man believes it too.
I'm struck by two things. We were recently at a small gathering together alongside with some other wonderful former podcast guests like Audrey Tang, the Taiwanese digital minister, and Rachel Kleinfeld, the great researcher on violence as well as American democracy. And you said a really striking thing in that context, which is, I think you quoted somebody saying this to you, that people always worry that we're going to forget history, and that's not what happens. We learn the lessons of history, and then we forget them. Which is really striking and may apply, to the broader conversation about populism as much as about this. One of the pieces of data that you presented is that you can look at the impact of populism on the economy. And when left-wing populists get elected, like in Venezuela, the economy immediately goes into negative territory and then becomes worse after that. When right-wing populists get elected, the economy tends to be boosted by that for a few years. They come in promising cuts to taxation, cuts to regulation, a business-friendly environment. And for the first few years, the markets buy that, investors buy it, and things go relatively well. And then those places tend to nosedive, and they end up in comparably bad territory as the left-wing economists, populists. Not quite as bad, but almost
not quite as bad. 15 years later, you're significantly poorer, about 10% poorer than you would otherwise have been, is the estimate.
And now, presumably, one of the mechanisms for this is that they tend to take control of the central bank.
This is one of the mechanisms. Yes.
And so, if we're seeing...
And they tend to mess up public finances, and that's why they have to take control of the central bank. They cut taxes too much. You can see this in the US now.
So my last question about Donald Trump, and then I want to move on to some other topics. Does this fit the pattern? The economy is doing reasonably well in the first years of him being in office, but soon he's going to be able to name the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He hasn't completely transformed the economic system, the tariff system, but you're certainly starting to see things that create drag for the U.S. economy. The trade deficit is up rather than down. Where does the U.S. fit into that slide that you presented?
My view is that it fits very well. One, I'll come to this in a second. The second point I would make, which is really, really important, is of course the U.S. is different from everywhere else. It's not a normal economy going into right-wing populism. It's the U.S. So it's the biggest economy in the world. It's certainly arguably the most technologically dynamic. I'm going to not engage in the debate between the US and China now. It's complicated, but it's got a fantastic reservoir of innovative strength, the world's most significant companies, and tremendous momentum. So messing up America is difficult. Okay, this is, and I always say this, messing up America is obviously completely different from messing up Argentina. That was true. Even if you compare it with Argentina as it was 800 years ago. So, but it does seem to me the trade policy has created wild unpredictability, and so is the investment policy. And this will affect investment. It's bound to affect investment. They have damaged some of the obvious well springs of American growth, immigration, the willingness of, I suspect, the willingness of talented foreigners, given what's going on there, to come and live and with their families and so forth there, must be diminished. Lots of Chinese people are certainly saying, well, my future in China will be better than my future in America. I think they've damaged universities and research institutions. They're damaging the rule of law and confidence in the rule of law. Quite generally, you can see that. And of course, the public finances soundness depends on getting the rates down. Why does he want the rates down? Because interest rates at current levels of debt, which are now back to where they were in 1945 after a world war. The debt ratios are so high. If he could halve interest rates, his public finance problems would go away. So of course he wants to lower interest rates because debt interest is such a huge part of his budget. But of course, once he says that, he's saying to all the people who hold treasuries and other forms of US, this is a very unsafe place to put your money. Sell treasuries and sell dollars. And you can see signs of that too. The dollar's rather weak. So we are seeing an immense machine, which I never underestimate, but they are making policy mistakes of exactly the kind that I would expect to show up in negative form over the next 10, 15 years if they're not reversed, slowing the growth rate, slowing the dynamism, and certainly more immediately a real risk of crisis in the bond markets, the currency markets, and therefore in public finances. And that could generate a profound shift in wealth owners' confidence in US liabilities, of which there are an incredible number, and that could generate a crisis, which would probably include a stock market crisis. That's the risk.
So you just returned from Davos. You wrote a column about it in the Financial Times. You said that two topics dominated. The first is Donald Trump, and we've devoted a good half an hour to that topic. The second is artificial intelligence. So I want to make sure to pick your brains on that also, because I've been thinking about that topic a lot of late. To me, the fundamental economic questions about artificial intelligence is whether it is a normal technology, as two writers recently claimed, or a profoundly abnormal one. There is a view of the way in which it is going to automate away some job, which is that we've gone through that many times in history. A new technology comes in, it is able to fulfill a bunch of tasks that humans previously did at lower cost. Those humans lose their job. That can be very traumatic for people who have invested very heavily into developing highly sophisticated skills, whether that's medieval monks copying books word by word, or whether that is telephone operators who, with great speed and dexterity, patch your incoming call through to the right recipient. New technology makes that obsolete. Bad for these people. Their life trajectory may be negatively affected. Their earnings may be negatively affected. If they're too old, they may not be able to retrain at a similar level of skill in some other profession. But good for the world as a whole, because the talents of future generations are freed up towards more productive uses. There's a reinstatement effect where suddenly new kinds of jobs show up. We're directing human talent into better fields. And that's how we all got richer. That's why the world is a lot richer today than it was 200 or 500 years ago. Now, there's also, I think, the case on the other side, which is that virtually all of the forms of automation in the past affected manual rather than mental work, that they tended to affect a particular profession, a particular activity, a particular task. And now we have these general purpose technologies that can be dropped into virtually any mental task. Your AI system doesn't just patch calls through more effectively. It can potentially substitute for your lawyer or your accountant or your social media manager or your HR manager or 50 other kinds of white-collar jobs. And that therefore there's not going to be a reservoir of need, of demand for human labor in the same way that there was in the past. Where do you fall? Do you think that that's fairly framed? And where do you fall on that debate? Do you think AI is going to be a big disruption, but one that ultimately leads to a bigger, more thriving middle class? Or do you think it's going to decimate middle class jobs in a way that is disanalogous to previous technological transformations?
So this is a very, very, very complicated question argument. So my answer to this is first, genuinely, I don't know. And I thought about it a bit, partly because I probably lack the expertise, but more important because I don't think we know. The discussions I've had with people in this area indicates to me pretty strongly that we don't know. And I suspect will take a while. But so let me separate this out into three areas. First, the economic impact. It seems to me that the core argument you're making, which is that this is a substitute for, if you like, skill trained thinking activities is different. The computer augmented that in the past, and now it appears it's going to substitute for it. And this is obviously very important because the people who do that are in some sense the core of our society and our economy. So something that displaces what they do, and most obviously it's going to start by displacing the young in these activities, whose jobs, entry jobs, will disappear and are disappearing first, is going to have an extraordinary economic impact, and because of that, an extraordinary social impact. I'll come to that further, but if you imagine that the displacement is huge and the new jobs that you talk about will emerge, as they usually do, really rather slowly, we could have a social and political crisis that makes deindustrialization look trivial. Because in the end, deindustrialization, though it, I think, is one of the biggest forces driving our world, shook the working class, the male working class, from top to bottom. But shaking the prospects of the educated middle class is socially clearly far more dangerous, and I think explosive, because it will affect them and their parents, who are basically the people who run our societies, in every possible way. So it does seem to me that the thing you described, the nature of the displacement, is going to have to create challenges, even if we get to a whole new set of activities. Then the question, obviously, is what those new activities will be, and how much will they be an augmented form of intelligent skill, which we can't easily imagine now, and how much will they be something completely different, and what will those be? Will they be relations among people in some way? I did discuss this at some stage. I won't mention this with who, because it wouldn't be fair, but somebody who is young and obviously very brilliant owner and creative of one of the leading firms, and I asked him this very question, and all I can say is he didn't have an answer. So if he didn't have an answer, nobody does. And that, so all I can say is, yes, logically, we should be able to find something else, but the question is, will we find something else which somebody is prepared to pay for? And if not, well, how do we support all these people? Which gets back to the capital ownership, the structure of ownership. Can we have really a technology revolution that essentially benefits the shareholders and owners of about 20 companies or 15 companies? That's revolutionary. The final point I would make, and this goes beyond the sort of the differential economics and the impact and the question of what will replace in the end, is, I think, a deeper question, and I'd be interested in your reaction. I tend to think, and this is perhaps because what I do is what I do, is that thinking and creating through thinking is sort of the core of what it means to be a human being. That's what makes humans different from all other animals. Well, if it's true, and there's a huge debate out there, if it's true, we're moving into a world, I don't think LLMs are this, but in which machines do all that as well as we do, or better, we basically made ourselves, deprived ourselves of any value in our own eyes as humans. So that would make it, if true, we live in a world with super machines and we know they're superior. If we live in that world, what are we going to think we as humans are for, if anything? And it does seem to me that's a profound existential question. So my instinct is to feel, for all these reasons, it would have been a very, very good idea that to bury this technology as soon as somebody invented it. It was never going to happen. Competition ensures that it won't be regulated successfully, so we're going to go on this journey. But the journey is one, perhaps that's a sign of my age, conservatism, also the fact that I have a lot of grandchildren. I am very concerned, and I think the thinking that is coming forward at a social level about what this means, how we control it if we can, is jejune and beyond jejune. And the idea that it's all under the control of 10 or so billionaires who are, in my view, to a greater or less extent, psychopaths, terrifies the wits out of me.
So a few thoughts. This is really interesting. I've written an article called "The Third Humbling of Humanity." Now, this draws on a concept by Sigmund Freud, who identified the first humbling of humanity as the realization that the universe doesn't revolve around the Earth, and the second humbling of humanity as the recognition that we're not God's special creation, but rather descended from apes. And he, of course, thought that the third great humbling of humanity was Freud's discovery of the unconscious, which I think is a little bit too much self-regard, so I discount that. Which is why I think that artificial intelligence is going to be the third big humbling of humanity. I mean, what is it that defined humanity? If you look at a lot of writing about this 200 years ago or 20 years ago, it's the fact that we are capable of acts of intelligence and artistic creation which set us apart from other primates, which set us apart from cats and dogs and cows and whales and other intelligent animals. It's the fact that we can compose poems and write short stories and make movies and sing songs. And if AI will soon be able to do all of that about as well as we can, and according to some studies, humans already prefer poems written by AI to some of the greatest poets in history, and translations of the Odyssey composed by AI to the translations of the various well-known translators of it, that I think poses a really deep existential challenge to us at the level of a species. Now, I'm a creative artist. I'm a writer. That's a form of creative art. I sadly do not have talents for music or painting. You really wouldn't want to hear me sing a song or look at a picture I painted. But I also think about this from a perspective of creative artists and how our role changes through that. Now, I think that I will always want to write out my own prose because I learned laboriously how to write clearly. I grew up in Germany where clear writing was not prized, and I owe it in many ways to your country, Martin, where I went to university to have had a couple of teachers who said, spare me with this convoluted stuff, write as clearly as possible, and it's the way that I make sense of the world and my own ideas. I also am, somewhat optimistic that my audience will still want to hear me talk and not some AI, and see me write and not some AI. But if we get to the place where it will be easier for me to put 2 lines of some idea and my past writings into an AI, and it can write my article better than I can, I'm still going to be writing my own articles, but it'll change my relation to the work. And the way that I think about this is the Etsy store problem. So, if you're in the 18th century and you are, making socks for your children, the reason for that is that you want them to stay warm through the winter, and it's an essential activity. It makes you feel needed. It is, something that has a very direct utility, which makes the activity satisfying. If you today have an Etsy store in which you sell handmade socks, that's a nice novelty item. It's a nice little luxury to have. I respect people who have Etsy stores, and I respect the people who buy handmade socks. But everybody knows that the factory-made sock would probably be more durable and more warm, and so on. So it's essentially a kind of indulgence. And I worry that acts of artistic creation are going to go from something that is essential to making sense of a world, and that in some abstract sense have real value to add, feel like a necessary activity, to a glorified Etsy store, a kind of novelty. Oh, look, this is a human-written text. And that is a crisis of meaning, perhaps less important than the broader one at the level of a human species that I evoked earlier, but that to people who take part in creative processes, I think is going to be traumatic in its way and require a lot of adjustment as well.
Well, this First of all, there's just to support your earlier comment about meaning. My favorite quote, which of course you know, is the Blaise Pascal quote: "Man is a reed, but he is a thinking reed." It's a definition of our fragility and what we are good at, what we mean. So I obviously share completely your view. I think I probably got 2 or 3 more years, and given my age, that's okay. But from but I agree with you. Now, I think there is a genuine question whether, and that's why I'm a bit skeptical about LLMs, large language models. I mean, essentially, they are built on whatever human beings have done. So whether they will turn out to be genuinely creative and original, I think we are still to see. I put forward the test. I don't know whether anyone's done it. Is if you gave a large language model or one of these models, maybe it's alpha something, all the facts known to physics in 1906. Would it work out the general theory of relativity, which emerged 10 years later? That's real creativity. But anyway, that's a question. But the more immediate and practical question is how we already have a crisis of reading because of smartphones and the sheer torrent of meaningless text which social media have created. So there's a wonderful new book by a British journalist called James Marriott on the crisis of reading. People don't read. Young people don't read. They're not used to reading books of any kind. Then you've got the problem when you go to university, as you said, and I spent my time learning how to write, which was essentially learning how to think. And doing maths is a different way. But what I learned in university was how to think and then express my thoughts. And
This is the meanest thing that I always want to say to students, and I often say it in general. I don't say it to specific students, but you have a certain kind of student who says, oh, I'm just a bad writer. And in my mind, I always think, no, you're a bad thinker. Because what happens if you're a bad writer is that the moment you sit down to actually formulate out your ideas, you realize that they're not in a coherent order and that there's gaps in the argument. And these are all things that in verbal speech, you can kind of paper over. Once the thing is on the page, that becomes much clearer. And so that's why I certainly think that the process of learning to write for me was the process of learning to think.
Well, if you can give a prompt to a large language model and it produces the text, then why should you learn that? So, and I think there's it's pretty clear. From what I can see, already we're seeing a collapse in these skills in young people. So they will emerge from university increasingly, essentially literate, and we may find activities for them, just as we found activities for people who used to make the most wonderful craftsmen. But this is more fundamental. So imagine a world in which the machines do all the thinking, they do all the planning, they basically run the world, and human beings are given enough to eat and entertainment, and there's no doubt still sex and all these activities. But essentially their lives, in my view, will be meaningless, and we will be meaningless. And that's the end of humanity as a striving, developing, creative species changing the world and the way they think about the world, which is how we change the world. So to me, it's the most frightening imaginable technology. And when I've written about this, I've gone back to the Dune series, whose great idea is, Frank Herbert's idea was, this civilization existed because at some point in the past, humanity revolted against and then banned the idea of thinking machines. And Frank Herbert, in writing that really very powerful series, it also has environmentalism in it and lots of other fascinating things. But the main idea is, if humans are to be human, they must, in some sense, be intellectually self-sufficient. And I happen to think, perhaps that's because of what I do and what you do, that without that, what's the point of living?
One final question about AI before I let you go to write your next column, I imagine.
Yes, indeed.
We tend to talk about this in the American or the European context. We tend to think about how that technology is going to impact developed economies, what it's going to do to the kind of well-remunerated professionals who partially are already losing their jobs because of it. There's mass layoffs at Amazon at the moment, which may be connected to the adoption and the desire to invest in artificial intelligence technology. What about the big rest of the world that is at middle income or that is at low income? On the one hand, this technology might be even more transformative there. If you have access to great educational resources, for example, AI can augment that. But it's perhaps less important than if you are in some remote part of the world where suddenly, access to an AI tutor can really introduce you to all kinds of skills and pieces of knowledge about the world that might allow you to escape some of those constraints. On the other hand, there's of course the concern that a lot of the kind of economic ladder that countries used in order to go from being poor to being more affluent, whether that's in manufacturing processes, many of which are being automated through physical machinery, or lower level service sector jobs like being somebody who works in a call center, is no longer going to exist in the same way. Are the countries that are poor now going to be empowered by AI, or are they going to get stuck at the bottom of the economic ladder with no way of ascending it?
I think that, again, it's something I've thought about on both dimensions, and the point is that new technologies pretty well always cut both ways. The initial stages of the Industrial Revolution in our countries, Britain is the most important case because it's where it started, was clearly impoverishing for the poorer people for half a century before the growth aspect started dominating. And a lot of that is to do with how it was organized and carried through socially and politically. That's Polanyi's great point. So it's partly how we respond. But it does seem to me that, because I don't have a clear answer, that it is going to depend, among many things, but including the incentives of the people who manage and control this. And when I look at who at the moment is managing and controlling it, I think it's a very, very safe bet that it is not going to be used for the benefit of the great majority of human beings, because why should it? Because it's being managed and controlled by a tiny group of human beings in one very rich country whose politics they largely control. So it will be miraculous if it turns out that for the great majority of poor people it is beneficial, because, as you said, one of the ladders that made them economically useful and whose resources they could then use to improve themselves, educate themselves, train themselves, that ladder is being, because of robotics, being broken. I think the key point is it looks plausible to me, no more than that we are moving into a completely new technological era. And the last one was basically the internet, social media, and all the rest of it. And clearly already that has transformed everything. One of the victims, I think, we probably would agree on this, is democracy. Now, it's made mob rule the norm. This is even more profound. Nobody's controlling it, and it seems to me perfectly plausible that it will catapult us into a completely new world. And we don't know who the victims will be, but there is a good chance that a very large number of poor countries will find their opportunities at least transformed so much as to change the potential. But I do agree with you, the commodification of knowledge and expertise must also give them huge advantages, because that's where they're short, and the countries where already possess very large reservoirs of human knowledge and expertise, well, that's going to be commodified. So it would seem to me it's going to get less valuable. So it could be very beneficial for poorer countries, but it's not going to be very good for what they can become in the end, because being a fully fledged human being, as we've discussed, does seem to me to demand something more than that.
Martin Wolf, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
It's a great pleasure.